Thanks so much for the invitation to explain this. A bit impromptu, but the information is really useful. This is about how things go funny in relationships and how human dynamics seem to take a life of their own, but also an almost predictable life of their own. This is called the drama triangle, and it's the work of Stephen Cartman. He first published in 1968, so the theory's been around for quite a while. And the article he wrote was Fairy Tales and Script Drama Analysis, which you can find in the Transactional Analysis Bulletin. So here's Steve Cartman's drama triangle. And the theory is that each of us, under certain circumstances, for some reason or another, seem to take up a particular role in our relationships with other people. There are three. Here's the triangle, and a very common role that people take up is one where they pretend to be, or they run some beliefs that they can't do things on their own, that they need help, that they are somehow less than other people, and we call that the victim position. So this is someone who's always helpless, hopeless, fishing for compliments, looking for other people to help them out. So of course what happens is someone comes along and comes with a complementary role. So it's almost as if these two people have hooks, and one goes through the world looking for someone to hook into. That person appears like a knight in shining armour on a white charger and makes the situation better in some way. The victim looks for and finds what we know as a rescuer. Now, as the victim has certain beliefs about her, himself, that they are less than, so the rescuer has complementary beliefs about people needing them. So one person is needy and one person is needed. So this person, very good intentions, very kind, always ready, always looking after other people, perhaps more than they actually want. So this is the person who comes into the room and says, how can I help? Does anyone need some help around here? That's the hook. And so rescuers often hook up with victims. Interestingly, there are certain professions that invite us to be in the rescuer position. So, for example, social workers, psychologists, coaches, people who do good in the world. Nothing wrong with doing good in the world. The question is, how much do we do? How far do we go? But the victim doesn't always meet someone who bails them out. Sometimes the victim meets someone else. In other words, meets a person in a different role to the rescuer role, and this is known as the persecutor. So, if the rescuer has a belief that I can make you feel good by helping you, and therefore confirm your victim position, so the persecutor has a belief that I can make you feel bad, and therefore confirm your victim position. So, it might well be that the victim, while hoping for a rescuer, actually meets a persecutor. The upshot is the same. The upshot's the same for all three. We confirm our beliefs about ourselves and how we be in the world, and we also help other people confirm their beliefs. So these are three very typical roles. Each of us has a favourite position. So if you're asking friends and my colleagues, they would probably tell you that I tend to start off as a rescuer. I want to make the world a better place. It's almost my leitmotif. And I sometimes go too far. I look for victims even when there aren't any victims who want to be looked for, so to speak. So Cartman says that each of us has a favourite role, and we take up that role, and when we do that, we're not really ourselves, we are literally playing a role. There's a touch of something pathological in there. So let me now give you some examples. I remember when I was unpacking a new PC and a new printer, a friend turned up and I'd got the PC packed out, and there was the printer and there was a printer cartridge, and I was thinking, oh my God, what do I do with this? And as he walked in to the room, I simply held up the cartridge. He took it out of my hand, unpacked it, unwrapped it, opened the printer, put it in, pressed some buttons, and it worked. It was fascinating. I had been victim just holding up the printer cartridge. He had taken on his rescuer position of not even asking me if I wanted him to do it, opening, unpacking, making it work for me. It was a wonderful example of how relationships slip into the same kind of patterns over and over. So, that's the first part of Cartman's theory. The second part of the theory is that we actually change position. So you might start off in one of these, like being a persecutor, being Mr. Grumpy, being blustery, always picking on people, and then you, for example, always regret it and you turn into Mr. Nice Guy, who then wants to make things better. A friend of mine was a principal in a school, always very, very helpful. At the beginning of term, he couldn't do enough for people, rescuer position. But by the time mid-term came along, he was really tired of being kind and helpful, and he slipped into being a persecutor. So the first half of the term, he trained people to come to him, so to speak, so he could look after them. But then he got tired, so he turned into Mr. Grumpy. So when someone knocked on the door and asked for some help, he would snarl at them rather than be helpful. They wondered what had happened, but when we look at the drama triangle, it's really quite simple. Another example would be a fight between Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Immediately you think, Mr. and Mrs. Smith have a fight, who goes where? The neighbours call the police 12:30 at night. Policeman comes, knocks on the door, says hello, hello, what's going on here then? Door opens. He sees Mrs. Smith with a black eye. Immediately he thinks Mrs. Smith is the victim and therefore Mr. Smith is the persecutor. So the policeman jumps on the drama triangle and says to Mr. Smith, "You are bad, I am going to arrest you." So he becomes the persecutor, and Mr. Smith then slips down to victim and says, "I didn't mean it, I'm not a bad person." Mrs. Smith now enters the game, jumps on the triangle and says, "He's really not a bad man, he didn't mean anything wrong, he's lovely, really." Both of them confirm that Mr. Smith is now in the victim position. However, the policeman persists at being persecutor, says, "I will take you to the police station." And so Mrs. Smith leaves her rescuer position and says, "Get your hands off my husband. He didn't do what you think he did," and becomes a persecutor. Whereupon the policeman slips from persecutor to victim and says, "I'm only trying to do my job." And so we dance around the drama triangle, leading to the maxim of British life, DGI, don't get involved. It's easier not to get involved. And actually, if we don't get involved, then we don't get on the drama triangle in the first place. So I'll show you in a minute, using the ego states, if you know that model, how we can not get involved. Let's have a quick dialogue. Someone in the audience is going to join me. And as you listen, I suggest you plot on here what's happening. We start.
What's wrong?
It's my PC.
Why don't you try rebooting?
Yeah, but it doesn't really work.
Why don't you call a technician?
Yes, but they're really quite expensive.
Why don't you use your laptop?
Yeah, well, it won't do the same thing. But tell me, who asked you anyway? So what you've heard is in a way quite a typical dialogue, and I start off as a victim with a sigh. That was the hook. And the rescuer heard the sigh and said, "Oh, what's wrong?" I didn't say what was wrong. I simply said, "It's my PC." And then he started coming with his very kind and helpful suggestions, which I hadn't asked for. So in the end, I stopped being a victim and became persecutor, and he left rescuer and became victim. And probably if he was a mate or if he was a colleague, we'd always have the same kind of dynamic. So, slight aside, those of you who know the parent-adult-child ego state model will recognise that the victim is actually the adapted child, but the negative adapted child, that the rescuer is the nurturing parent, but the negative nurturing parent where we do it too much, kind of smother, and the persecutor is the negative controlling parent. So that's the book of Steve Cartman. It's brilliant, so useful. And he said that actually, while the roles are pathological in their nature, there's actually 10% that's okay. Now, A.C. Choi heard this and developed what's known as the winner's triangle, taking the same dynamics but taking out the pathology. Let me show you. Instead of the V for victim, we have the V for voice, because what the victim doesn't do is ask directly or use their voice to say, "Please help me," rather than simply, "It's my PC." And another way of saying the V would be not voice but vulnerability. People don't like to show their vulnerability, so they just do victim. If they said, "Help, I need something," then they would be owning their vulnerability and it wouldn't be pathological. Nothing wrong with being powerful. The persecutor, however, uses his power over others to make them feel bad. We could reframe it and say that P is simply for powerful. How would it be if you simply owned your power and used it to make the situation better? The third role is not rescuer, but responsive, I-V-E at the end. And we're responsive to the requests from the other person. So, with this dialogue that you've just heard, I sighed and there was a response. And there was a rescue rather than someone being responsive to what I said, which was, "What do you need? Can I help?" Then we would have had a contract and we wouldn't have got into the psychological hook that went on. A.C. Choi actually used slightly different words. For responsive, the word is caring, and for powerful, the word is assertive. This, believe it or not, was published in 1968, and A.C. Choi published in the Transactional Analysis Journal in 1990. Both articles are really worth reading. Thank you so much.
Very good. Very good.